I would like to give a little background before I read Mark 13. Beginning the year of Mark necessitates reminding ourselves of the theological premise that grounds Mark's story of Jesus. Mark links the baptism of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus through narratives that open heaven to us. For the heavens open and the Spirit descends at Jesus' baptism, and the temple curtain tears in two at Jesus' death. Anything that can be simply opened can be easily shut again, and we would never know it happened. Lest we think that God can be let out for a little while, but when we've had enough, put back behind closed doors, Mark's gospel rips that image apart for us. That which separates us from God, either the heavens or the Holy of Holies, has been torn asunder and can never go back to the way it was. Bookending this gospel is the conviction that there is no keeping God at a distance anymore. God is not and will not be where we expect to find God. And so, appropriately so, we find ourselves beginning Advent in the middle of Mark's little apocalypse. At the beginning of chapter 13, the disciples are enamored by the scale and beauty of the Jerusalem temple, and they have a little Red Riding Hood moment where they look up and they say, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." And Jesus' response to them is this apocalypse, this teaching of the temple's coming destruction, and warning them that a desolating sacrilege will profane the temple, along with many tribulations, including false messiahs and false prophets. And this is where we start our gospel reading this morning. It is no accident that these words of warning and destruction of the temple mark the start of the Passion narrative. For Mark, the temple is no longer the location of God. If we do not find God in the temple, where do we find God? This theological question establishes a very good question for Advent, a wonderful place for us to start. Where will we look for God this Advent season? The answer for Mark is not in the glorious temple, but rather on the cross. Not in the city proper, but outside the city walls. Not in the center of power and authority, but out in the wilderness. Not on Wall Street, but in Zuccotti Park. Not in the ports of capitalism, but in the Grant Ogawa Plaza in Oakland, California. Not in the halls of our city governments or state governments, but in Dilworth Plaza City Hall in Philadelphia. In Chicago, Minneapolis, Boston, Hartford, London, Paris, Barcelona, Hong Kong. Maybe God is occupying this Advent season. Maybe. I have paid close attention to the Occupy movement. I have watched how faith and spirituality has woven its way into and through the movement, how it has popped up in all the encampments, tents, interfaith tents, amongst the campers' tents. I know no movement is perfect and not Occupy, but it speaks to much that is close to my heart. This movement calls us to an awareness of gross injustice, cruel, indifferent societies, and corporate greed and fraud. These young people and all who have joined them, faith leaders included, are risking everything through nonviolent resistance to call our attention to the dangers of the false prophet greed, unemployment, hunger, homelessness, lack of adequate health care, and more. My friends, The sun is darkening. The moon is losing its light. The stars are falling from heaven. The powers of heaven are being shaken. Are you awake? Are you listening? God can no longer be boxed into our churches, our synagogues, our mosques. The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is the people inside these walls, the people outside these walls. God is in the tents being erected all over this world. God is calling us this morning, and for the past 2.5 months, to stay awake, to keep watch. Are you listening? Rita Nakashima Brock, feminist theologian and activist, offers us a reflection of her work as a faith leader at Occupy Oakland. She writes in her blog, "Until Wednesday last week, members of the interfaith tent at Oakland, the name of a space as well as an identity, had worked hard to stop a second police raid of the encampment. Those and other efforts failed, and we faced the fact that an eviction was inevitable. A few of us met to discuss what nonviolent resistance to eviction would mean. 14 in the interfaith tent at Oakland said yes to arrest. The night before the November 14th eviction, the interfaith tent marked our space of peace, sanctuary, and nonviolence, with a half circle of candles in front of the entrance. We prayed together, we centered ourselves, sat with arms linked, and sang protest songs for most of the 3 hours between the time the police arrived and the time of our arrests. During that time, protesters stopped to speak to us and thank us as they passed by. One supporter drove over midday on Monday after all the arrests and the clearing of the eviction to Grant Agawa Plaza and was startled to see just one tent standing, hours after the eviction. And it was the interfaith tent, a witness to the moral force of this 99% movement. Did the police leave it because we had declared it sacred space and sanctuary? Or because they did their job but felt a solidarity with our movement? We'll never know, she writes, but it seemed a miracle that the interfaith tent stood for 6 hours after the raid, the lone witness to justice. God's holy, sacred space was left untouched. It was acknowledged, feared, maybe. It stood there proclaiming God's justice for all to see, a beacon of hope and transformation in the wilderness of our lives. You see, when we occupy from a space of faith, from a place grounded in God's love, in God's justice, whatever we choose to occupy, whether it be a park, whether it be our church, whether it be our jobs, whatever we choose to occupy will become a better place for everyone around us. God's love, God's justice, God's peace is more powerful than any force out there. When we heed the call to enact God's justice, love, and peace in this world from a place of faith, revolution begins. God's realm rains down from heaven. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, we can see that God's realm was raining down from heaven. It came out of their faith. It was the faith of Oscar Romero and his work in El Salvador that brought about the justice for people. God's realm was raining down from heaven. You see that again in Gandhi's work of nonviolence in India. We see that today in Mel White's work for the inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people, and so forth. All these movements for justice, all these movements calling for an end to persecution and oppression became revolutions because they started from a place of faith, a deep connection where they tapped into the energy of God and the justice of God. They transformed the world in which we live, changing us forever. They became, and they still are, beacons of light and hope for all of us to see, empowering all of us forward, and calling us to stay alert to the false prophets around us, reminding us that justice is possible if we choose to stay the course, if we choose to keep awake, to stay alert, to work, to bring God's realm here on earth. Jesus is calling us this Advent season to take heed, to act upon God's justice around us. As we seek this place of God in our Advent season, let us widen our gaze and move outside these walls, seeking justice and peace. Remember that the church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is a people. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church together. All who follow Jesus all around the world. Yes, we're the church together.